This hearing is not about welfare fraud. It's about placating Donald Trump. This committee is holding this hearing for the same reasons that it's ignoring the massive corruption we know that Donald Trump is engaged in and his family. For the same reason that Republicans are protecting pedophiles right now, the DOJ is right now actively deleting Epstein files while we're at war with Iran. It's why we're holding hearings on this rather than on ICE abuses or the fact that Donald Trump just took us into war without even consulting with Congress, let alone getting our authorization for military use. Thank you, Mr. Chair, for convening in this hearing. Let's start at the outset by just stating the obvious. Waste, fraud, and abuse are horrible. They're stealing from taxpayers. They're taking money and food out of the mouths of hungry kids. I have spent my career fighting against fraud. I started my career at the SEC, prosecuting corporate fraud, continued on as a law professor, teaching the next generation. And as someone on the Oversight Committee, this is a very, very important issue to me. Again, every dollar that is stolen.
Massive. The Supreme Court didn't just deny an appeal. They shattered the one thing Trump has been clinging to through every scandal, every indictment, every crisis, presidential immunity. The shield is gone, and everything it was protecting is now exposed. We're not talking about a procedural hiccup here. We're not talking about a minor legal technicality that only constitutional law professors care about.
From these programs is a dollar that's not just taken from us hardworking taxpayers. It is something that is meant for a better use. And so I appreciate the gist of this hearing, but as I pointed out in prior hearings on allegations of fraud in Minnesota, the singular and exclusive focus on the Somalian community in Minnesota seems very partisan and wrong, because we know there's massive fraud across this country, particularly in southern states, including states like Florida and Mississippi. Mississippi is still at trial right now over $77 million in welfare fraud. Federal prosecutors have recently arrested a Russian national accused of submitting billions of dollars in fraudulent schemes in Texas and Florida. And of course, Oklahoma and Alabama consistently rank as the highest states when it comes to SNAP fraud. And yet we've only focused on Minnesota.
This is a seismic, landscape-altering, political earthquake kind of bombshell. This is the kind of ruling that rewrites the rules of engagement for the rest of his presidency and throws open the doors to the House chamber for a third and potentially final impeachment showdown. The Supreme Court just looked at the emergency appeal, the desperate plea to pause the lower court's decision, stripping away his protection.
As a freshman member, I've been here 14 months, but I've learned that their House Republicans are all single-issue voters with just a handful of exceptions. And that single issue, the only thing that you all care about is whether you're on Team Trump or not. And so when Donald Trump goes after Minnesota and falsely claims that he won the election there 3 times and that it was rigged against him, I pay close attention. When he says that he would no longer admit Somalians to this country because they contribute, quote, nothing to this country, I listen. That's a wildly racist statement, but it's going to reflect what Republicans are going to do, and that is why we're holding this hearing. I care about welfare fraud, and I care about the scumbags who rip off taxpayer money. But if this was about welfare fraud, we'd be also hauling in people like Mississippi Governor Tate Reeves and former NFL quarterback Brett Favre, who clearly knew about a scheme to send money to build a volleyball facility at the college his daughter was playing at, receive funds for $600,000 or more for work that he never did from the government, again, taking money from the mouths of children that are hungry.
And they issued a cold, unsigned, devastating denial. They said no. And what were they saying no to protecting? This is where the rubber meets the road and where the panic in the West Wing must be absolutely deafening. We are talking about the weaponization of the Department of Justice.
No, this hearing is not about welfare fraud. It's about placating Donald Trump. This committee is holding this hearing for the same reasons that it's ignoring the massive corruption we know that Donald Trump is engaged in and his family, soliciting bribes from foreign governments and private companies in exchange for regulatory favor, for the same reason that Republicans are protecting pedophiles right now and that the DOJ is right now actively deleting Epstein files while we're at war with Iran. It's why they ignore their oath to support and defend the Constitution of the United States. It's why we're holding hearings on this rather than on ICE abuses or the fact that Donald Trump just took us into war without even consulting with Congress, let alone getting our authorization for military use or force or actual declaration of war in direct contravention of the Constitution of the United States.
Turning the most powerful law enforcement agency on the planet into a personal hit squad against political rivals. We are talking about launching unauthorized military strikes on Iran, raining down fire without the blessing of the people's representatives. We are talking about the obstruction of justice surrounding the Epstein files, the active concealment of evidence that the public has a right to see.
But for those of us who care about taxpayer dollars, let's focus on that. This is horrible, but of course we have seen instead a different type of abuse of our taxpayer dollars. They've taken our taxpayer dollars and used them to fund abuses against our American people, as a number of our witnesses have aptly described. And I want to just point out that until the murder of Alex Preddy, not a single DHS or ICE agent accused of wrongdoing, witnessed or videotaped assaulting Americans was suspended, faced any disciplinary action. That doesn't happen with police. When my local law enforcement are accused of misconduct, certainly if they're videotaped shooting someone, they are subject to an investigation. Maybe they're justified or not, but they're suspended, removed from duty, investigated. None of that has happened until the murder of Alex Preddy and the outrage around that.
Every single one of those nightmare scenarios is now legally exposed. Every single one of those actions is fair game for prosecutors, and more immediately for the impeachment managers in the House of Representatives. The lower court, the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals, had already delivered a brutal verdict on Trump's conduct. They drew a line in the sand and said, "This is not what the presidency is for." They explicitly ruled that the actions in question exceeded what they called the core constitutional functions of the office.
Now, Governor Walz, I want to just briefly ask you, what's the economic impact that the deployment of ICE in Minnesota has had over the past few months?
Well, thank you, Congressman. I thank you for your characterization. I associate myself with you on fraud is horrific. It is corrosive. It hurts those people that are there, and taxpayers should demand accountability. And I think that's what we're trying to take. The issue can, again...
What's the economic impact? I know business...
Look, for us, we just had our economic numbers, and I would tell people that we have to balance the budget every year. Minnesota is strongly, we're AAA bond rated. That shows up good. It doesn't account for what happened over the last 3 months. And by estimates, the city of Minneapolis estimates they lost $200 million alone. And I remind people, you saw pictures of Minneapolis. This happened across the state. Near my hometown of Mankato, Minnesota, in St. Peter, we saw a woman that was pulled over at gunpoint, a citizen. The chilling effect it had, businesses going under, especially immigrant-owned businesses, people who are here legally, citizens, starting businesses. We're shut down.
I'm just going to reclaim my time to make one final point here. I was at Minneapolis, had the chance to meet with you and others. I also met with a number of local police chiefs. And one of the things they told me, first, this is not the first time ICE has operated in Minnesota. But in the past, what is different about this time is that they did not coordinate. They did not tell anyone. And that resulted in a lot of 911 calls, because when you see masked men jumping out of vans, pulling people out, assaulting them, punching them in the head, as happens all the time with ICE agents. And by the way, that's not a matter of training. It's a matter of picking people who are predisposed to violence. That costs our local police quite a lot of money. It's one of the reasons I'm going to be introducing the Recoup Act so that local jurisdictions are repaid for the funds that they expend due to ICE misconduct. With that, I yield back.
Gentlemen, yields back. Before I recognize Ms. Boebert, Mr. Gill, I understand you have a UC.
You don't get a golden ticket to break the law just because you sleep in the Lincoln bedroom. You don't get immunity when you use the DOJ as a cudgel against your enemies. You don't get immunity when you bypass Congress to start a war in the Middle East. You don't get immunity when you cover up evidence in a case that has captivated the world's darkest suspicions. That was the lower court's finding, and the Supreme Court just let it stand. Think about the psychology of that decision. If the Supreme Court...
Yep, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I ask unanimous consent to enter into the record a letter from the America First Policy Institute dated March 3rd, 2026, which details widespread and rampant fraud in Minnesota.
Without objection, so ordered. Chair now recognize Ms. Boebert from Colorado.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm going to summarize some of the things that have already been said here today rather than ask these questions directly. The federal prosecutors that we have now charged nearly 100 individuals across multiple Minnesota fraud schemes, including Feeding Our Future and related Medicaid, daycare, and autism programs, with 85 of those charged being of Somali descent. Governor Walz, your administration's Department of Education and Department of Human Services failed to act on multiple early fraud warnings about Feeding Our Future, allowing the theft of at least $250 million in federal child nutrition funds that were supposed to feed hungry kids during the COVID-19 pandemic. Governor Walz, I'd like to turn to the demographics and policy choices that enabled this. Since you took office, the Somali population in Minnesota has grown substantially. Recently, Fox 9 reported, the reporting puts the total over 107,000. Did your administration's soft on immigration policies, including expanded refugee programs and temporary protected status, contribute to that rapid growth?
thought for a single second that Trump had a viable legal argument here, if they thought there was a snowball's chance that his immunity claim was legitimate, they would have paused this. They would have hit the brakes. They would have granted the stay to preserve the status quo while they deliberated, but they didn't lift a finger to save him. The institution that he believed he had packed, the court he thought was his firewall against accountability, just opened the gate and let the process roll forward.
I couldn't speak to why people moved to Minnesota, other than it's a great place to live.
It could be a sanctuary policy and refugee programs and temporary protected statuses. According to the Center for Immigration Studies analysis of census data, 81% of Minnesota households headed by Somali immigrants receive one or more forms of public assistance, compared to just 21% of native-born Minnesotan households. Why is that disparity so extreme under your watch, sir?
I can't speak specifically, Congressman, but I would anticipate that new generation immigrants, whether they be Norwegian or whether they be Hmong or whether they be Somali, probably on the front end as they're establishing home ownership, education.
I think we should be bringing folks to our country that are going to contribute and not just siphon off of the tax dollars
They are
of
contributing.
American citizens. Mr. Governor Walz, yes or no, would stricter vetting of immigrants and refugees have prevented many of these fraudsters from entering our country in the first place?
I wouldn't have any way to know that.
Do you agree with stricter vetting processes for those who are coming to our country?
I don't care where you're coming from. If you commit fraud, you're going to jail in Minnesota. That's what I care about, and that's what I'm here for.
Yes or no, should Somali immigrants or any other immigrants who defraud American taxpayers and steal funds intended for hungry children be deported immediately?
That's a decision for the federal government. You're responsible for immigration.
They essentially told the country, we are not going to be the ones who protect this man from the consequences of these specific acts. And the timing? The timing is a masterpiece of political cruelty. Trump is underwater in approval, gasping for air at depths that make re-election a near impossible climb. His own party is fracturing on live television, voting to strip his war powers and whispering about his fitness for office. Cabinet secretaries are fleeing the building like rats sensing a structural collapse.
Governor Walz, do you know who Victoria Eileen Harwell is?
I do not believe I do.
What about American Mafalda Tyer?
I don't believe I do.
There. These are Minnesota women who were brutally killed by illegal aliens in your state. You don't know who they are, so I would also assume that you did not attend their vigils or speak out to their families when they were brutally killed by illegal aliens.
I'm not familiar with both of these, no, Congresswoman.
No, just the hard-hitting CNN ones. Yes or no, would you support ending Minnesota's sanctuary policies to stop these fraudsters and murderers from using your state as a safe haven?
Well, as I said on June 12th, we don't have sanctuary policies, and Tom Homan reiterated that here in the past few weeks that we do not either, and that we are cooperating as required.
Thank you, Governor. Will you direct local law enforcement to fully cooperate with ICE and federal agents and follow federal immigration laws that are currently on the books?
They do. If they want to do more, they can, but we have a floor that they have to. And that's been proven time and time again in Minnesota over this. That's why they're leaving, because we had cooperated.
Final question for you, Governor. There are multiple documented reports of Somali immigrants entering sham marriages, including siblings and close family members, solely for immigration purposes. Are you aware of these reports, and what, if anything, has your administration done to stop this kind of immigration fraud happening in your state?
States are not responsible for immigration screening, and I'm not familiar with what you're
You're not responsible for any vetting whatsoever?
Federal government.
Well, this is happening under your watch, and there's immigration fraud, so we will do everything that we can. And hopefully you allow your local law enforcement officers to coordinate with federal agents when we are going after these immigration fraudsters.
As
Thank
we
you,
do.
Governor.
Thank you.
And now, the Supreme Court has handed the Democratic leadership a legal sledgehammer. They've given Hakeem Jeffries and the impeachment caucus the one thing they needed most: judicial validation. Jeffries didn't waste a second. He took to the floor and, in the language of a man who knows he's holding a winning lottery ticket, he made the connection crystal clear. He told the chamber and the world that even the justices Trump appointed, even the conservative legal movement he nurtured, agrees that war crimes and Epstein-related obstruction are not shielded by the Oval Office. They are fair game. According to the courts themselves, the president has crossed the line from executive action into illegal overreach. And if the courts say the line has been crossed, what excuse does Congress have for standing idly by? This is the new political reality. The Supreme Court just handed Congress a green light that is so bright, so unmistakably neon, that ignoring it becomes an act of political cowardice. It removes the fog of legal ambiguity. It changes the question from, is this illegal, to, what are we going to do about it now that we know it's illegal? Let's rewind for a second and appreciate the irony of this moment. This is the same man who celebrated a massive immunity victory not that long ago. He thought that ruling was an all-access pass. He thought it was a permanent suit of armor against every sling and arrow of the justice system. He believed he was bulletproof, that no court in the land could touch him for anything he did while wearing the title of president. He operated under that assumption, pushing the boundaries of executive power further and further, convinced that the courts would always have his back. But the law is a maze, not a monolith, and the lower courts started carving out exceptions. They looked at the specific nature of the allegations, the personal vendettas, the unconstitutional wars, the cover-ups, and they said, this isn't the job, this is the abuse of the job. They drew a distinction between official acts and criminal acts committed from the official's desk. And when Trump ran to the Supreme Court begging them to erase that distinction and widen the shield, they refused. They let the carve-out stand. They narrowed the immunity for him. They said, you thought you were protected forever? Think again. Chief Justice Roberts had been telegraphing this move for weeks. Anyone who was paying attention to the rulings on the tariff cases and the emergency powers limits saw the writing on the wall. Roberts has been on a quiet crusade to reassert the primacy of Congress and the limits of unilateral executive action. He slammed the overreach on tariffs. He said presidents need clear, explicit authorization from the legislature for their major moves. The principle was set. The president is not a king. And now, that principle has been ruthlessly applied to the criminal and impeachment arenas. This legal defeat doesn't exist in a vacuum. It's the centerpiece of a total system collapse. Look at the calendar of disasters. The Attorney General nominee got caught lying through her teeth about the Epstein client list. GOP senators, in a stunning rebuke, voted to handcuff Trump's ability to wage war on Iran without them, and members of his own cabinet have been resigning over what they describe as illegal military planning. It's a perfect storm where the legal case for impeachment is getting stronger by the hour, and the political will to actually pull the trigger is being fueled by the Supreme Court's own gavel. Democrats can now stand at the podium and say, we are not making this up. We are not on a partisan fishing expedition. The courts, his courts, agree with us. He broke the law. What more evidence do you need, Republicans? Let's dig into the anatomy of this bombshell order. What did the Supreme Court actually do on that fateful day? It was an unsigned order, a terse collective slap from the bench. Trump's legal team had filed an emergency application for a stay. In plain English, they were asking the justices to hit the pause button. They wanted the lower court ruling that stripped his immunity to be frozen in place while they appealed. They wanted to buy time. They wanted to keep that protective bubble around him intact for as long as humanly possible, hoping the political winds would shift or the midterms would change the composition of Congress. And the Supreme Court said, application denied. No lengthy dissents that gave him hope. No explanation that offered a loophole. Just a cold, hard, procedural door slam. And in the language of the court, that kind of denial speaks volumes. It's a signal that the justices don't think his legal argument has a high likelihood of success. Why grant a stay to protect someone if you think they're ultimately going to lose the case? You don't. You let the lower court's judgment take effect. You let the immunity evaporate. You let the accountability begin. The D.C. Circuit Court's reasoning is the key to unlocking this entire nightmare for Trump. They looked at the core constitutional functions test. The presidency comes with immense power, but it's not a blank check for personal vengeance or military adventurism. Weaponizing the Justice Department against your political foes, that's not a core function. That's a felony dressed up in a suit and tie. Ordering sustained military strikes without Congress, especially when Congress has explicitly told you to stop, that's not a core function. That's a violation of the separation of powers that the founders bled for. And obstructing the release of evidence related to Jeffrey Epstein, that's not a core function. That's a cover-up. The court said that because these acts fall outside the protective halo of legitimate presidential duties, the immunity shield does not apply. You can be sued for these things. You can be investigated for these things. And crucially, you can be impeached for these things without being able to hide behind the argument that a president can't be impeached for doing his job. The court has just defined these actions as not the job. This connects directly to the Roberts Court's broader philosophy. In that earlier tariff case, Roberts laid down a marker. He was saying that the days of the imperial presidency, where the executive can do whatever it wants under the guise of national security or economic emergency, are over. He said Congress has a voice, and if the president ignores that voice, he acts at his own peril. That peril has now manifested as the loss of criminal and civil immunity. Now let's pivot to the political earthquake this has triggered, because the legal ruling is just the detonator. The actual explosion is happening in the halls of Congress. Hakeem Jeffries, the House Democratic leader, is not a bomb thrower by nature. He's a strategist, and he immediately recognized this ruling for what it is, the ultimate political cover. He stood up and effectively told the Republican conference, "Your own justices think he's out of control. The courts have found that he exceeded his constitutional authority. The war crimes and the Epstein obstruction are now officially on the table. We are not the ones saying this. The judiciary is." That is a rhetorical masterstroke. It transforms impeachment from a Democratic obsession into a judicial mandate. It pressures moderate Democrats who are worried about the political blowback. More importantly, it pressures the small handful of Republican senators and representatives who still care about the institutional reputation of their party and the Constitution. They can no longer hide behind the "this is just a partisan witch hunt" defense, because the hunt is now being led by judges in black robes. And this is all happening against a backdrop of absolute Republican chaos. You have GOP senators voting to rein in Trump's war powers. That's an open revolt on national security. You have cabinet members resigning. That's an admission that something is rotten inside the building. You have the Bondi perjury scandal exposing the DOJ's inner workings. That's a confirmation of the very weaponization the courts are talking about. Every single one of these threads is being woven into a rope that is tightening around this presidency. The Supreme Court's decision is the accelerant on a fire that was already burning out of control. It's the difference between a smoldering constitutional concern and a five-alarm inferno. Let's break down the devastating, multi-layered implications of this ruling, because this is where we separate the noise from the signal of what actually happens next. The shield is gone. The most important legal defense Donald Trump had in his arsenal was the assertion that a sitting president is immune from accountability for his official actions. That shield had holes poked in it by the lower courts, but it was still theoretically intact, pending Supreme Court review. Now, for the specific charges of DOJ weaponization, unauthorized Iran strikes, and Epstein obstruction, the shield is in pieces on the floor. The Supreme Court has allowed the ruling that says no immunity to stand. That is a devastating legal blow. It means the discovery process can move forward. It means the impeachment inquiry has the legal wind at its back. It means the threat of post-presidency prosecution is now a tangible, terrifying reality for him. The impeachment argument becomes unassailable. For months, the impeachment threat has been a sword hanging by a political thread. Republicans could block it in the House if they had the majority, or the Senate by claiming it was a policy dispute, not a high crime. That argument just evaporated. You cannot call it a mere policy dispute when the Supreme Court allows a ruling that defines the actions as outside the bounds of constitutional protection. Democrats now have the judicial branch as their star witness. They can walk into any press conference, any hearing, any debate, and say, "The Supreme Court has determined that Donald Trump does not have immunity for these acts. The only constitutional remedy left for an out-of-control executive is impeachment. We are doing our duty." The psychology of desperation. This ruling doesn't just change the legal calculus, it changes the mental state of the principal player. Donald Trump is no longer just fighting for his political legacy or his approval rating. He is now fighting to stay out of prison. When the Supreme Court signals that he is not protected from prosecution for these acts, the stakes become existential. This is the kind of pressure that leads to cornered animal behavior. It leads to more frantic social media posts, more desperate attempts to cling to power, and potentially more erratic decision-making in the Situation Room. A president who believes he is facing personal legal doom is a president who is capable of anything to change the subject or disrupt the process. The midterm massacre looms larger. Trump's political standing was already on life support. Numbers in the 30s are not a launching pad for a successful midterm defense of the House or Senate. This ruling pours concrete on his ankles. Suburban swing voters, the ones who decide elections, don't like chaos and they don't like lawlessness. The image of the Supreme Court slapping down the president on matters of war and justice is a toxic image that will dominate ad buys for the next several months. Republican candidates will be asked one question over and over again. Do you agree with the Supreme Court that the president's actions were outside his constitutional authority? There is no good answer for a Republican in a competitive district. Say yes and you alienate the base. Say no and you look like you support lawlessness. This ruling is an anchor around the neck of every GOP candidate on the ballot. The fracturing of the GOP accelerates. We've seen the cracks, the war powers vote, the cabinet resignations. This Supreme Court ruling takes a crowbar to those cracks and pries them wide open. There is a faction of the Republican Party, however small, that is made up of institutionalists and libertarians who genuinely believe in the Constitution's separation of powers. They've been uncomfortable for a while. This ruling gives them the permission structure they need to break ranks. It allows a senator like a Mitt Romney or a Lisa Murkowski or a Todd Young to stand up and say, "The court has spoken. I swore an oath to the Constitution, not to a man. I will vote to convict." It may only take a handful of such defections to turn the impeachment is doomed narrative into impeachment is a coin flip. The international specter, the whispers are already there. The discussions about the International Criminal Court, about war crimes tribunals, about the Hauga. When a domestic Supreme Court signals that a leader does not have immunity for unauthorized military action, it emboldens international bodies. It validates the claims of those who say Trump's Iran strikes violated international norms and laws of armed conflict. While the U.S. is not a signatory to the ICC, this ruling creates a massive diplomatic vulnerability. Travel to certain allied nations could become fraught with legal risk. It's another front in the war for his freedom that he never anticipated fighting. The death of the witch hunt narrative. For years, the go-to defense has been to cry witch hunt and deep state. But who is the witch hunter now? It's the Supreme Court. It's the institution that he and his allies spent decades trying to shape. It's incredibly difficult to sell the American public on the idea that the Supreme Court is part of a deep state conspiracy against a Republican president. That message plays to the hardcore base, but it falls flat with the middle. This ruling delegitimizes the victimhood narrative in a way that no Democratic talking point ever could. So where does the domino fall from here? The House, if controlled by Democrats, will move with lightning speed. The Judiciary Committee already has the templates, the evidence, and the witnesses. This Supreme Court action is the final piece of the puzzle. They will draft articles of impeachment centered on the very acts that the courts have said are unprotected, the abuse of the Justice Department and the unauthorized war in Iran. The Senate trial becomes a spectacle unlike any other. The Chief Justice presides. The House managers will play the audio of the Supreme Court arguments. They will read the text of the denial. They will look at those Republican senators and ask, if the Supreme Court won't protect him, why are you? For Trump himself, this is the ultimate betrayal. This is the institution he thought he owned turning on him. It's a reminder that in the American system, no one is above the law, not even the person who appoints the judges. The system of checks and balances, battered and bruised, is showing that it still has a pulse. This is the moment where the legal jeopardy and the political reality collide at high speed. The Supreme Court has lit the fuse. The question is no longer whether the impeachment bomb will go off, but how large the black blast radius will be and who will be left standing in the rubble. The panic in the White House is real. The walls are talking. The justices have spoken. And the midterms just became a referendum on whether the country agrees with the highest court in the land. Stay locked in, because the ride from this bombshell to the Senate floor is going to be the most intense chapter of this entire saga. This isn't just a legal ruling. It's a death knell for the era of untouchable executive power. And Donald Trump is the one standing in the way of the wrecking ball.